The world outside the facility was completely different from the one they had left 6 hours ago. President Linda Hayes emerged into sunlight that felt wrong somehow, even though it looked exactly the same. She was driven back to Washington in a convoy that seemed too casual for someone who had just saved humanity from extinction. The streets were full of people going about their normal lives with no idea how close they had come to annihilation. Linda watched them through the car window and felt a profound loneliness. She knew something none of them would ever know. Admiral Kyle Morrison returned to the Space Defense Command and found everything changed. The emergency protocols they had activated were gone. The mobilization orders had never been issued. His officers greeted him normally and asked about his inspection tour of the Colorado facility. Kyle played along and pretended that was why he had been gone. He sat at his desk and pulled up the orbital sensor logs. The data showed nothing unusual for the past 72 hours. No alien ships had appeared. No energy signatures had been detected. The Velcrin fleet had been completely erased from every record. But Kyle remembered. He remembered watching those massive crescent-shaped vessels hanging in orbit. He remembered the fear and the desperate hope and the moment when they had vanished from existence. He pulled up a personal encrypted file on his computer and began writing everything down. He documented the invasion and the response and the temporal strike. He knew the file would seem like science fiction to anyone who read it, but he needed to record the truth. The 50 witnesses had agreed they would each keep detailed records so that future generations might understand what had been done. Captain Ryan Clark and Lieutenant Karen Hughes returned to their normal duties with the Space Reconnaissance Division. The Horizon still existed, but it was just a prototype stealth ship used for testing new technologies. The mission to steal data from the Velcrin fleet had never happened in this timeline. Karen still had the encrypted sensor logs from that mission, stored on a personal drive she kept hidden. Sometimes she would review the data late at night and watch the alien ships dissolve into nothing. It was the only proof she had that any of it had been real. Dr. Peter Grant walked through the Temporal Research Facility in Colorado and saw it with doubled vision. In one set of memories, this was the place where humanity's greatest weapon had been built and fired. In another set of memories, it was just an experimental physics laboratory studying theoretical concepts that might never have practical applications. The massive quantum field generators were still there, but their purpose had changed. Now they were described as tools for studying the fundamental nature of space-time, rather than weapons for rewriting history. Dr. Amy Sullivan found the transition hardest of all. She was a scientist who valued objective truth and measurable reality, but now she carried memories of events that had objectively never occurred. She knew the mathematics of temporal mechanics, but experiencing the results firsthand was different. She would be working on routine calculations and suddenly remember the desperate race against the Velcrin deadline. She would be having coffee with colleagues and remember the moment the array had fired. The two realities overlapped constantly in her mind. Dr. Eric Stone tried to explain the situation to a friend one evening and quickly realized it was impossible. His friend listened politely as Eric described the alien invasion and the temporal solution. Then his friend laughed and asked if Eric had been watching too many science fiction movies. Eric smiled and agreed that it did sound ridiculous. He never tried to tell anyone outside the 50 witnesses again. The burden of knowing was meant to be carried only by those who had volunteered for it. The witnesses began meeting regularly in secret to discuss their shared experiences. They gathered once a month in various secure locations around the world. President Linda Hayes attended every meeting despite her busy schedule. They would sit together and talk about the invasion that nobody else remembered. They would review their written records and make sure the details were preserved accurately. They found comfort in each other because they were the only ones who truly understood what had happened. Commander Lisa Bennett, who had led the diplomatic stalling efforts, found herself in a strange position. In the current timeline, she had never sent those messages to the Velcrin because the Velcrin had never come. But she remembered every word of those conversations. She remembered the fear in Commander Zeth's voice when his ships began to fade. She remembered the satisfaction of knowing that her stalling had bought just enough time. Sometimes she wondered if Zeth had understood what was happening to him in those final moments. Years passed and the witnesses grew older. Some of them died and took their memories to the grave. The survivors continued to meet and maintain their records. They watched as humanity continued to advance and explore space. Earth built colony ships and sent them to nearby star systems. Humanity encountered other alien species and established peaceful relations. None of those species had ever heard of the Velcrin Empire, because it had never existed beyond its homeworld. Kyle Morrison retired from the Space Defense Command after serving for 35 years. On his last day, he stood in the observation deck where he had watched the Velcrin fleet vanish. He was alone and spoke quietly to the empty space. He thanked the universe for giving humanity the intelligence and courage to save itself. He thanked the 50 witnesses for carrying the burden of memory. Then he went home to a world that was safe because of actions that had never officially occurred. One night, Peter Grant received a transmission from deep space. It was from a probe humanity had sent to the Scorpius constellation years ago. The probe had reached Velcros Prime and sent back images of the planet. Peter watched the data come in and saw a peaceful civilization that had never left its home world. The Velcrin were there, living simple lives, farming and building and raising families. They had art and music and philosophy. They had never developed advanced weapons or starships. They were not conquerors. They were just another species trying to survive and find meaning in the universe. Peter felt no hatred for them. How could he hate people who had never done anything wrong? In this timeline, the Velcrin were innocent. Only in the memories of 50 humans did they bear the guilt of genocide and empire. Peter wondered if that was justice or mercy or something beyond either concept. He decided it did not matter. What mattered was that Earth was safe and the Velcrin were at peace. Both species would continue to exist without ever knowing how their histories had intersected and diverged. Amy Sullivan wrote the final report on Project Cascade 30 years after it had been completed. The report was sealed and would not be opened for 100 years. In it, she described everything that had happened and everything that had been sacrificed. She wrote about the mathematics and the engineering and the desperate gamble that had saved billions of lives. She wrote about the 50 people who had volunteered to become living paradoxes so that reality would not collapse. She ended the report with a simple statement that she hoped future readers would understand. She wrote that humanity had been given a choice between fighting and thinking, between destroying the enemy and erasing them from history, between vengeance and mercy. Humanity had chosen the path that required the most sacrifice and the least violence. They had won a war by ensuring the war never happened. They had defeated an empire by preventing it from rising. Future generations would never know how close they had come to extinction, but that was acceptable. Sometimes the greatest victories were the ones that nobody remembered. Linda Hayes lived to be 93 years old. She served 2 terms as president and then retired to write her memoirs. The official memoirs made no mention of aliens or time manipulation, but she kept a separate private journal that told the real story. On the last page, she wrote a message to whoever might read it someday. She wrote that humanity had learned something important during the Velcrin crisis. Power was not about having the biggest weapons or the strongest military. Real power was about having the wisdom to use force only as a last resort and the intelligence to find better solutions. The 50 witnesses slowly decreased in number as age and illness took them one by one. Each time one died, the remaining witnesses would gather and honor their memory. They would retell the story of what had happened, making sure every detail was preserved. They knew they were the guardians of a history that existed only in their minds. When the last witness died, the truth would exist only in sealed records that might never be read. But that was enough. They had done what was necessary to save their world, and that was all that mattered. Kyle Morrison was the last witness to die. He passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 98. The night before he died, he had looked up at the stars through his bedroom window. Somewhere out there, the Velcrin lived on their blue giant world, never knowing they had once been humanity's greatest threat. Kyle smiled at that thought. Humanity had not destroyed them or enslaved them or sought revenge. Humanity had simply removed the conditions that had made them dangerous. It was the most complete victory possible. It was the victory of wisdom over violence. It was proof that sometimes the best way to win a war was to make sure it never happened at a. The silence in orbit was deafening. Admiral Kyle Morrison floated in the observation deck of the International Space Station, staring at the empty void where 12 alien warships had hung just minutes before. He pressed his hand against the cold glass and tried to process what he had witnessed. The Velcrin fleet had not retreated or exploded or jumped to hyperspace. They had simply stopped existing as though they had never been there at all. Kyle had seen many impossible things in his career, but nothing had prepared him for watching an entire civilization vanish from reality. Captain Ryan Clark guided the horizon back toward Earth with hands that trembled slightly on the controls. Lieutenant Karen Hughes sat beside him, reviewing the sensor data they had recorded. The readings made no scientific sense according to conventional physics. Matter could not simply disappear without leaving any trace. Energy had to go somewhere. But the Velcrin ships had violated every known law of thermodynamics by ceasing to exist completely. Karen saved all the data to encrypted storage because she knew that very few people would ever be allowed to see it. Down in the Colorado facility, Dr. Peter Grant was experiencing a growing sense of dread. The temporal array had worked perfectly and the Velcrin had been erased from history exactly as planned. But something was wrong with the mathematics. Dr. Eric Stone had noticed it first and brought it to Peter's attention immediately. The quantum probability equations were showing instabilities that should not be there. The timeline was not settling into a stable state. Instead, it was fluctuating between two possible realities. Dr. Amy Sullivan joined them at the main display and studied the readings. Her face went pale as she understood what was happening. They had created a paradox. In the new timeline, the Velcrin had never developed faster than light travel and had never built an empire. That meant they had never come to Earth. But if they had never come to Earth, then humanity had no reason to build the temporal array. If humanity had never built the array, then they could not have sent the quantum wave back in time. If they had not sent the wave, then the Velcrin would still exist and would still have come to Earth. The logic was eating itself in an infinite loop. President Linda Hayes was brought into the facility and the situation was explained to her. She listened carefully while the scientists showed her the mathematical models of the collapsing timeline. Two versions of history were trying to occupy the same space, and reality could not support both of them. Eventually, one timeline would win and overwrite the other. The problem was that nobody could predict which one would survive. Earth might end up in a reality where the Velcrin had never existed, but neither had the array. Or Earth might snap back to the moment before the array fired and face destruction from the alien fleet. Peter stood at the whiteboard and worked through the problem while everyone watched. He wrote equations and crossed them out and wrote new ones. The mathematics were incredibly complex, but the basic problem was simple. They needed a way to anchor certain events in place so the timeline could stabilize around them. Some people needed to exist outside the normal flow of cause and effect. They needed observers who could remember both timelines and serve as a bridge between them. Without such anchors, reality would continue to fluctuate until it collapsed entirely. Dr. Eric Stone understood what Peter was suggesting, and the implications horrified him. Someone would have to be placed in a quantum superposition state, where they existed in both timelines simultaneously. They would remember the Velcrin invasion and the activation of the array, even in a timeline where those events had never happened. They would carry the burden of knowing a history that nobody else remembered. They would be living paradoxes walking around in normal reality. The strain on human minds would be enormous and possibly fatal. Linda looked around at the assembled group of scientists and officers. She saw exhaustion and fear in their faces, but also determination. These were the people who had saved Earth from extinction. They had worked impossible hours and solved impossible problems. Now she was going to ask them to make one more sacrifice. She asked for volunteers who would be willing to become temporal anchors. She explained clearly that they would remember events that had never happened. They would know about threats that nobody else believed in. They would carry secrets that could never be shared. 50 people stepped forward immediately. Among them were Kyle Morrison and Amy Sullivan, and Peter Grant and Eric Stone and Ryan Clark and Karen Hughes. They all understood that someone had to do this or everything would fall apart. Linda looked at each of them and felt pride mixed with sadness. These were Earth's heroes, but they would never receive recognition, because their heroism existed in a timeline that was being erased. She thanked them and told them to follow Amy to the temporal stabilization chamber. The chamber was located in the deepest part of the facility where the quantum field generators created zones of isolated space-time. Amy led the volunteers inside and helped them into specialized chairs that would hold them motionless during the process. She explained that they would be placed in a state of quantum superposition for approximately 6 hours, while the timeline finished stabilizing. During that time, their consciousness would exist in both realities simultaneously. When they emerged, they would remember everything from both timelines, and their memories would serve as anchors that prevented reality from collapsing. The process was not guaranteed to be safe. Nobody had ever attempted to place living human beings in quantum superposition before. The mathematics suggested it would work, but mathematics were not always right about biology. There was a real chance that some or all of them would not survive. Their minds might fracture under the strain of holding contradictory memories, or their bodies might reject the quantum state and simply cease to function. Peter told them this plainly because they deserved to know the risks. None of them changed their minds. President Linda Hayes entered the chamber last. Peter tried to protest, saying that Earth needed its leader, but Linda refused to listen. She had given the order to activate the array, and she would share in the consequences. She took her place among the volunteers and strapped herself into one of the chairs. Amy worked quickly to attach monitoring equipment to everyone. She checked vital signs and brain activity levels. Everything looked stable for now, but there was no way to predict what would happen once the quantum field was activated. Amy stepped out of the chamber and sealed the door behind her. Through the thick glass window, she could see the 50 volunteers sitting calmly in their chairs. She returned to the control console and began the initialization sequence. The quantum field generator spun up with a low hum that vibrated through the floor. Inside the chamber, the air began to shimmer as normal space-time was suspended. The volunteers felt a strange sensation, like being in two places at once. Their minds expanded to hold memories that conflicted with each other. Kyle Morrison remembered watching the Velcrin ships arrive, and also remembered a normal Tuesday morning when nothing unusual happened. Both memories felt equally real. Amy Sullivan remembered working desperately to build the temporal array, and also remembered it being just another research project that was never urgent. Peter Grant remembered calculating the targeting coordinates for Thracken's laboratory, and also remembered the Velcrin being a theoretical exercise in xenobiology. The contradictions should have driven them insane, but somehow their minds adapted and accepted both realities as true. The 6 hours passed slowly for those waiting outside the chamber. The timeline readings gradually stabilized as the quantum anchors took effect. Reality stopped fluctuating between possibilities and settled into a single stable state. In this timeline, the Velcrin had never developed an empire and had never come to Earth. But 50 people would remember that they had. Those 50 would carry the knowledge of the invasion that never happened, and the war that humanity won by erasing the enemy from history itself. When the chamber door opened, the volunteers emerged, changed. They looked tired but otherwise healthy. Linda Hayes stood and stretched her stiff muscles. She looked at the others and saw understanding in their eyes. They all shared memories that the rest of humanity did not have. They were the witnesses now. They would remember so that the sacrifice and the danger and the victory would not be forgotten, even though officially it had never occurred. The deadline arrived faster than anyone wanted. 68 hours had passed since the Velcrin first appeared, and humanity had only 4 hours remaining before Commander Zeth would begin destroying cities. President Linda Hayes stood in the command center deep beneath Colorado, surrounded by the scientists and military officers who had worked without sleep to prepare Project Cascade. Everyone looked exhausted but determined. Linda gave the authorization code that would begin the final sequence. There was no turning back now. Dr. Amy Sullivan sat at the main control console with her hands hovering over the activation switches. The temporal array was ready, and the targeting coordinates were locked onto that moment 3,000 years ago when Thrackan made his discovery. Amy had checked every calculation a dozen times, and they were as perfect as human mathematics could make them. But she was still terrified because they were about to do something that no species in the galaxy had ever attempted. They were going to reach back through time and change history itself. The power requirements were staggering beyond anything Earth had ever attempted before. Every nuclear reactor on the planet had been connected to the array through a network of superconducting cables that ran beneath the oceans and continents. When Amy activated the sequence, those reactors would dump their entire output into the temporal displacement system all at once. Cities would go dark, and factories would shut down, and hospitals would switch to backup generators. For 15 minutes, Earth would be running on minimum power while the array consumed enough energy to light up the entire planet for a year. Admiral Kyle Morrison watched the orbital sensors from his station. The Velcrin fleet was moving into attack formation. Their weapons were charging, and their targeting systems had locked onto major population centers. New York and Beijing and London and Moscow were all marked for destruction. Kyle realized that Commander Zeth had decided not to wait for the deadline. The aliens had grown tired of human stalling tactics and were preparing to attack early. He spoke into his headset and told Linda they were out of time. Linda looked at Amy and gave the final order. Amy took a deep breath and activated the temporal displacement array. 5 miles beneath the surface, the massive machinery came to life with a sound like thunder. Quantum field generators the size of buildings began spinning up to speeds that defied physics. Chronometric stabilizers created bubbles of isolated time, where seconds passed differently than in the normal world. The temperature in the array chamber dropped to near absolute zero, as energy was pulled from the very fabric of space. Up above ground, the effects were immediate and dramatic. Every light in North America went out at the same instant. The power grid collapsed as electricity was rerouted into the array. People screamed in the darkness thinking the aliens had attacked. Car engines died and planes flying overhead lost power and glided toward emergency landings. The same thing happened across Europe and Asia and every other continent. For the first time in 100 years, the entire planet went dark simultaneously. The Velcrin noticed the massive energy surge immediately. Commander Zeth stared at his sensor displays in confusion as readings spiked off the scale. Something was happening beneath Earth's surface, but he could not identify what. His science officers told him the humans were generating power levels that should be impossible for their primitive technology. Zeth ordered his weapons to fire immediately, but then something strange began happening to his ship. The lights flickered and alarms started blaring throughout the vessel. Back in the Colorado facility, Amy watched her displays as the quantum probability wave was generated and compressed and aimed backward through the fourth dimension. The wave existed outside normal space and time, so it could travel to any point in history instantaneously. The targeting system locked onto Velcro's prime 3,000 years in the past. It found Thraken's laboratory and identified the exact moment when he was working on the equations that would lead to his breakthrough. The wave was released. 3,000 years ago, on a planet orbiting a blue giant star, a Velcrin scientist named Thraken sat in his laboratory surrounded by calculation stones. He had been working on a theoretical problem about the nature of space for months. Tonight he felt close to a breakthrough. He arranged the stones in a particular pattern that represented the relationship between mass and the fabric of reality. For a moment the pattern seemed to reveal something profound. Then suddenly his concentration broke. One of the stones had a flaw he had not noticed before. The calculations were wrong. Thraken stared at his work in frustration. He rechecked everything, but the flaw in that one stone had corrupted the entire pattern. He tried different arrangements and different approaches, but nothing worked. The insight he had felt moments ago was gone like a dream he could not remember. After several more hours, he gave up and went home disappointed. He would return to the problem many times over the years, but would never find the solution. Faster-than-light travel remained a mystery that the Velcrin would not solve for thousands more years. In the present moment above Earth, the Velcrin ships began to flicker. Admiral Kyle Morrison watched through the viewport of the space station as the massive vessels started becoming transparent. He could see stars shining through their hulls. Inside those ships, the Velcrin crew members were experiencing something no living being should ever experience. They felt themselves becoming less real. Their memories began to fade and rewrite themselves. The empire they had served was disappearing from history and taking them with it. Commander Zeth tried to give orders but found he could not remember what he was supposed to be commanding. The ship around him was dissolving like smoke and wind. His crew members were fading away one by one, vanishing into nothing as the timeline corrected itself. Zeth looked down at his own hands and watched them become ghostly and insubstantial. He tried to scream but had no voice. Then he was gone and had never existed at all. Captain Ryan Clark was still in orbit aboard the Horizon when the effect reached them. He had positioned his ship to observe the Velcrin fleet and document what happened. Karen Hughes recorded everything with her sensors as the 12 massive warships simply ceased to exist. They did not explode or retreat into hyperspace. They faded out of reality like images on a screen when the power is shut off. Within 90 seconds, the entire Velcrin fleet was gone. The space above Earth was empty except for human satellites and stations, but the effect did not stop there. The quantum wave propagated forward through time, rewriting history everywhere the Velcrin had touched. On distant planets that had been conquered centuries ago, the Velcrin occupation forces vanished. Native species that had been enslaved suddenly found themselves free. Worlds that had been strip-mined and destroyed were restored to their previous states. Billions of beings across the galaxy suddenly existed in a timeline where the Velcrin Empire had never risen to power. Dr. Peter Grant monitored the temporal readings from Earth. The wave was spreading through causality like ripples in a pond. Every battle the Velcrin had fought was being erased. Every ship they had built now never existed. Every conquest they had achieved was undone. The Velcrin species still existed on their homeworld, but they were primitive and peaceful. They had never left their star system and never would. They lived simple lives under their blue sun, completely unaware that in another timeline, they had been galaxy-spanning conquerors. The power came back on across Earth as the array shut down. Lights flickered to life in cities and homes. People emerged from the darkness confused about what had happened. President Linda Hayes addressed the world and explained that there had been a massive power failure during a military exercise. She did not mention aliens or time manipulation or the war that had been prevented. Most people accepted the explanation and went back to their normal lives. They would never know how close they had come to annihilation. The temporal array could not simply delete the Velcrin at random. Dr. Peter Grant explained this to the assembled team in the underground facility as they began their work. They needed to find the exact moment in history when the Velcrin civilization had started down the path to becoming conquerors. It was like finding one specific grain of sand on a beach that stretched across thousands of years and light years of space. One wrong calculation and they might erase the wrong species or create a paradox that would destroy Earth. Instead, Dr. Amy Sullivan led the Temporal Mapping Division, which consisted of 30 scientists working in shifts around the clock. They used quantum entanglement sensors to peer backward through time, but the process was incredibly slow and difficult. Every hour of scanning took massive amounts of power and produced data that had to be carefully analyzed. Amy barely slept during those first 24 hours. She drank coffee until her hands shook and kept working, because she knew that every minute counted. The Velcrin deadline was approaching, and they were still blind to the aliens' past. Captain Ryan Clark volunteered for the most dangerous part of the mission. Someone needed to get close to the Velcrin fleet and steal their historical records directly from their computers. Earth's remote scanning could only tell them so much, but the aliens would have detailed records of their own history stored in their database systems. Ryan was given command of a small stealth ship called the Horizon that had been built using experimental technology. The ship's hull was covered in metamaterial that bent light and radar around it, making it nearly invisible. Ryan chose a crew of 8 people who all knew they might not come back. Lieutenant Karen Hughes was his technical officer, and she would be responsible for hacking into the Velcrin systems. The Horizon launched at midnight from a hidden base in Nevada and climbed silently into orbit. The alien fleet was positioned above the Atlantic Ocean, and their sensors were focused downward on Earth cities. Ryan guided his ship slowly through the orbital space around them, using minimal thrust to avoid detection. It took 3 hours to reach the nearest Velcrin vessel and position the Horizon alongside its hull. Karen activated the hacking equipment and sent out thin probe filaments that attached to the alien hull. The probe searched for data ports and communication channels while Karen monitored for any sign that the Velcrin had noticed them. After 40 minutes, she found an access point and began downloading information. The alien computer systems were strange and used mathematics that human computers had never seen before, but Karen was brilliant and she adapted quickly. Data started flowing into the Horizon's computers at incredible speeds. Terabytes of information about Velcrin history and culture and technology filled their storage banks. The download took 90 minutes and every second felt like an hour. Ryan watched the proximity sensors waiting for Velcrin fighters to appear and blow them out of space. Karen's hands moved across her controls with steady precision, even though sweat was running down her face. Finally, the download completed and she pulled the probes back into the ship. Ryan immediately fired the engines and the Horizon slipped away from the alien fleet as silently as it had arrived. They were back on Earth 4 hours after they had left, and nobody on the Velcrin ships ever knew they had been there. Dr. Eric Stone was the mathematician assigned to analyze the stolen data. He was young but had a mind that could see patterns in chaos better than any computer. Eric locked himself in a room with the Velcrin historical records and began building a timeline of their entire civilization. What he found disturbed him deeply. The Velcrin had been violent conquerors for over 10,000 years. They had destroyed hundreds of intelligent species and turned entire star systems into lifeless wastelands. Their empire covered thousands of light years, and they showed no mercy to anyone who resisted them. But Eric kept searching backward through their history, looking for the beginning. Every civilization had an origin point, and every empire had a moment when it truly began. He worked for 18 hours straight until his eyes burned and his head ached. Then he found it. 3,000 years ago, the Velcrin had been a primitive species confined to their home planet. They had technology roughly equal to Earth's 19th century. They fought tribal wars and had no concept of space travel. Then one scientist changed everything. His name was Thraken, and he was a physicist who had been studying the nature of space itself. According to the records, Thraken had discovered the equations for faster-than-light travel completely by accident, while trying to solve an unrelated problem. His discovery had been shared with the Velcrin military, which immediately saw its potential. Within 50 years, the Velcrin had built their first starships and left their homeworld. Within 200 years, they had conquered their first alien civilization. The empire had grown from there, spreading like a cancer across the galaxy. Eric brought his findings to Dr. Peter Grant and Dr. Amy Sullivan. They reviewed his work and confirmed his conclusions. Thraken's discovery was the key moment they needed to target. If they could prevent that one scientist from making his breakthrough, then the Velcrin would remain primitive and confined to their planet. Without faster-than-light travel, they could never build an empire. They would just be another species living peacefully in their own star system, completely unaware that they had once been humanity's greatest threat. Amy began programming the targeting coordinates into the temporal array. The array would send a quantum probability wave backward through time to the exact moment of Thraken's discovery. The wave would not destroy anything or kill anyone. It would simply introduce a tiny error into Thraken's calculations, one small mistake that would lead him down the wrong path. He would spend years trying to solve the problem but would never succeed. Faster-than-light travel would remain beyond the Velcrin's reach, and human history would never intersect with theirs. Peter authorized the final preparations. Power plants around the world were put on standby to feed energy into the array when the time came. The targeting coordinates were checked and rechecked by 3 different teams. They had only one chance to get this right. If they missed the target or miscalculated the temporal coordinates, they would waste Earth's only shot at survival. The Velcrin would follow through on their threat and billions of humans would die. Everything depended on perfect execution. Commander Lisa Bennett continued her diplomatic stalling with the Velcrin. She sent long, detailed proposals about how Earth would be governed under Velcrin rule. She asked questions about their laws and customs. She requested time to prepare Earth's populations for the transition. Commander Zeth grew impatient, but he enjoyed watching the humans grovel, so he granted small extensions. He had no idea that every hour he gave them brought Earth closer to erasing his entire existence from reality. The morning sky over New York turned dark at exactly 9:30 when the alien ships arrived. People stopped on the streets and looked up at the massive vessels that blocked out the sun. The ships were enormous and shaped like crescents with sharp edges that gleamed in the remaining light. There were 12 of them hanging in the atmosphere, and each one was bigger than any city humanity had ever built. The Velcrin had come to Earth, and they had not come in peace. Admiral Kyle Morrison was drinking coffee in the Space Defense Command when the alarm started screaming. He dropped his cup and ran to the main control room where dozens of officers were staring at their screens in shocked silence. The alien fleet had appeared without warning, and without any way for Earth's sensors to detect them coming. Lieutenant Karen Hughes turned to him with fear in her eyes and said they had tried every communication frequency, but the aliens were not responding. Kyle ordered everyone to battle stations, even though he knew Earth's weapons were useless against ships this advanced. All they could do was watch and wait. The wait did not last long. At 10:15, the aliens finally spoke. Every television and radio and computer screen on Earth suddenly showed the same image. A tall creature with gray skin and 4 arms stood before a dark background. Its eyes were black and empty like deep space itself. When it spoke, the words came out in perfect English, which meant they had been watching humanity for a long time. The creature said its name was Commander Zeth of the Velcrin Empire and that Earth now belonged to them. Humanity had 72 hours to surrender completely, or the Velcrin would destroy every major city on the planet. Then the transmission ended and the screens went back to normal. President Linda Hayes called an emergency meeting with world leaders within minutes. They gathered in a secure bunker beneath Washington, where thick walls would protect them from conventional weapons, but probably not from whatever the aliens had. The room was filled with presidents and prime ministers and generals all talking at once about evacuation plans and last stands and negotiation attempts. Linda listened to them argue for 10 minutes before she held up her hand for silence. She told them that fighting was pointless and running was impossible, and begging would only make humanity look weak. What they needed was something the aliens would never expect. That was when Dr. Peter Grant entered the room. He was a thin man with gray hair and glasses who looked more like a college professor than humanity's last hope. He had been working in secret for the past 5 years on a project that most people thought was science fiction. Peter walked to the front of the room and connected his tablet to the main display. Charts and equations filled the screen, but he simplified it for everyone. He said his team had discovered how to manipulate time itself at the quantum level. They could not build a time machine that sent people into the past, but they could send effects backward through history. They could change events that had already happened. The room erupted in questions and doubts, but Peter kept talking. He explained that if they could find the exact moment when the Velcrin Empire began, they could prevent it from ever existing. They would not destroy the alien fleet above Earth because that would just bring more Velcrin ships for revenge. Instead, they would erase the entire civilization from history. The Velcrin would never evolve into conquerors and would never build starships and would never come to Earth because their empire would never exist. It was the most complete victory possible, because the enemy would be defeated before they ever became an enemy. General Ryan Clark stood up and asked how long it would take. Peter said they needed at least 60 hours to prepare the temporal array and gather enough data about Velcrin history to target the right moment. That gave them only 12 hours of buffer before the deadline. Linda looked around the room at all the worried faces and made her decision. She told Peter to begin immediately and ordered everyone else to keep the aliens distracted. They would send diplomatic messages and ask for negotiations and do whatever it took to buy time. The Velcrin thought humanity was primitive and weak, so they would probably enjoy watching humans beg for mercy. Dr. Amy Sullivan joined Peter in the command center within the hour. She was one of the few people on Earth who understood temporal mechanics well enough to help with the calculations. Together they began programming the massive underground facility that housed the temporal displacement array. The array was buried 5 miles beneath Colorado and stretched for miles in every direction. It had cost trillions of dollars and taken years to build under the cover of a geological research project. Now it would finally be used for its true purpose. Meanwhile, Commander Lisa Bennett was put in charge of the distraction operation. She sent a message to the Velcrin saying that Earth's leaders needed time to convince their populations to accept surrender. She asked for a meeting to discuss terms and conditions. The aliens agreed, but only gave them 6 hours to prepare a proposal. Lisa did not care because she had no intention of actually surrendering. All she needed to do was keep talking and keep the Velcrin thinking they had already won. Up in orbit, the Velcrin fleet waited with weapons charged and ready. Commander Zeth stood on his flagship bridge looking down at the blue planet below. He had conquered 47 star systems before this one, and Earth would be his 48th. The humans were already begging for time, which meant they knew they could not fight. It would be an easy victory like all the others. He did not know that beneath the surface of that blue planet a weapon was being prepared that would do more than kill him. It would unmake him and everyone like him across 3,000 years of history. The countdown had begun. Earth had 60 hours to complete Project Cascade before the Velcrin deadline expired. Scientists worked around the clock while diplomats sent meaningless messages to keep the aliens occupied. Nobody on Earth slept that night. They all knew that this was humanity's one chance to survive and they could not afford to fail. The aliens thought they were dealing with a frightened primitive species, but they were wrong. Humanity had always been good at finding clever solutions to impossible problems. This time the solution was not to fight harder, but to fight smarter. They would let the aliens think they had won right up until the moment those aliens ceased to exist.